So welcome to this new webinar of the IEA Africa University series. My name is Zakia Adam. I'm very pleased to be here today with my colleagues, Stéphane Lorenzik, who is an electricity energy analyst, Jean-Baptiste Dubreuil, senior gas analyst, and Craig Hart, energy analyst. So my colleagues will share with you the insights from the two reports, so the electricity market report and the gas market report, and also some findings on Africa. Before we get into the presentation by my colleagues, I would like to do some scene setting and say a few words on the IEA for those who may not be familiar with our institutions. So the IEA has been created in 1974 after the first oil crisis. It is an international organization that aims at facilitating the coordination of energy policies of its member countries and beyond. Even though our initial mandate was to ensure the security of supply, mainly oil, in order to support economic growth, since the past 50 years, the IEA has expanded its expertise to all energy sources. We collect data and do analysis on almost all countries of the world and all energy sector and all technologies. For Africa, we work extensively with AFREC, for example, but also with many local governments and ministries. At the IEA, we have around 300 statisticians, analysts, and experts on energy that work within the agency. And the IEA, we ensure also policy advice to its members and beyond. We also work extensively on climate and clean energy transitions. And through our regular trainings, we work closely with many countries to help them improve their data collection and build models. With the support of the European Union, the IEA is implementing a capacity reinforcement program for 10 sub-Saharan African countries. And in this program, for the moment, we are doing only online courses for each country, but we also do several other activities and have bilateral work. We are hoping to start doing in-country activities as soon as the COVID situation allows us. Last but not least, if you want to be kept informed of our activities, then do not hesitate to join our WhatsApp groups by country and also our LinkedIn community. Without any further ado, I pass the floor to my colleague, Stéphane, for the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Zakia. I hope you can see the screen. Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks. Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for joining this presentation today. Yeah, my name is Stéphane Lorenzik. I'm energy analyst at the IEA for electricity and the lead author of IEA's electricity market report. I want to start by giving you a brief overview of the topics we are covering in the presentation today. At first, we will present the findings of the electricity market report, which was published in January this year. The report covers a wide range of topics around global electricity markets, looking at demand, supply, emissions, and other topics. And we had a special focus on 2021 in the January edition, and we have our forecast for the years to come, so for 2022 until 2024. I will start by giving you an overview of the global developments in electricity markets before handing over to my colleague Craig, who will present in greater detail our analysis on Africa. After that, my colleague Jean-Baptiste will present recent developments in global gas markets, also with a focus on Africa. Okay, starting with a global perspective. Here on the slides, you can see the change in global electricity demand, and some countries are highlighted here that are especially, or some countries or regions are highlighted here that are especially important. So you see the global change in absolute demand. In 2020, we saw a small drop in global electricity demand. This was due to the global COVID-19 pandemic and the related restrictions to everyday life and the decline of economic activity. Compared to the decline of global GDP, which was around 3%, the decline in electricity demand was relatively small with below 1%. This is due to electricity or the industry sector, the commercial services sector being only part of total electricity demand, the rest being, of course, households. After the small drop in 2020, global electricity demand grew by 6% in 2021. This was the largest relative growth since 2010, after the financial crisis. Global electricity demand was boosted by a rapid economic recovery, combined with more extreme weather conditions than in 2020. China and India, which are the first and third largest electricity consuming countries worldwide, contributed significantly to the global increase. They both, so China and India both increased between 9% and 10% in their electricity demand, and both reached new all-time highs. In China alone, which is the world's largest electricity consumer, around half of the global demand increase took place. Although also the United States and Europe contributed significantly to the growth, this was rather a recovery from the losses in the previous year than an additional demand compared to previous years. The industrial sector was the largest contributor to the growth, followed by commercial and services, and finally the residential sector. For the next years, we expect continued global electricity supply growth led by countries in emerging and developing Asia, especially China and India. However, given the current situation, meaning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there are large uncertainties regarding the future development. As Russia is a large exporter of gas, coal, and oil, global energy prices are currently at all-time highs, which is also affecting electricity markets where we see very high prices as well. This could negatively impact the global economy, which is still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, high consumer prices might also have an effect on domestic or local, household consumption. Coming now to the global overview of the supply side. This slide shows the change in electricity generation by fuel in recent years and the outlook until 2024. So you can see the colors for the different fuels, where we have a nuclear change in yellow, coal in like the dark brown color, gas in violet, renewables in green, and then we have the dots indicating the net change. As you can see, coal met more than half of the increase in global demand in 2021, growing by 9%, which was the fastest since 2011. After falling in 2019 and 2020, coal electricity generation reached a new all-time peak. 55% of the net growth of coal in 2021 took place in China, followed by close to 20% in India, as well as further 20% in the United States. The growth was propelled by the exceptional electricity demand growth and high gas prices, which made coal more cost competitive than gas in some markets. Also, renewables grew strongly by 6%. This was the largest growth ever in absolute terms, and this growth was despite unfavorable weather conditions, in particular for hydropower. For more than 70% of the additional renewable generation, more than 70% of the additional renewable generation took place in the Asia-Pacific region, and close to 50% alone in China. So in China, not only we had a large increase in coal-fired generation, but also in renewables. For the period 2022 to 2024, we expect rapidly growing renewables to almost match the demand growth. As you can see here in the figure, between 2022 and 2024, the whole bar is almost green, indicating that this is all additional renewable generation. We expect renewables to grow by on average 8% each year and serve more than 90% of the additional demand during that period. As a consequence of slowing electricity demand growth and significant additions of renewable power capacity, we expect fossil fuel-based generation to broadly be flat in the coming years. Coming to the emissions side, on this slide, you can see the global annual change of CO2 emissions by fuel in the electricity sector. As you can see, this is largely dominated by the changes in coal-fired electricity generation as the largest contributor to CO2 emissions in the sector. After falling for 2 years in a row, CO2 emissions from electricity rose by close to 7% in 2021 to a new record high. This is a consequence of a strong increase in coal-fired electricity generation. As you can see, there is a small part of gas as well, but most of it is from coal-fired generation. As we expect electricity demand growth to slow down in the next years and to have a very high additional renewables generation, we estimate or we forecast that emissions between 2021 and 2024 will plateau. As you can see here in the years 2022 to 2024, we have almost no change in emissions. However, in IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, emissions in the electricity sector decreased significantly until 2030. This illustrates that massive changes are needed in terms of energy efficiency, additional low carbon supply from nuclear plants and renewables for the electricity sector to reach a zero emissions pathway that is consistent with being net zero by 2050. And with that, I want to hand over to Craig, who will have a closer look at the electricity sector in Africa.
Thanks, Stefan. And yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Craig Hart. I'm an analyst in the Renewable Integration and Secure Electricity Unit at the IEA. And I was author on the Africa Regional Focus for this electricity market report. So on the next few slides, I will go into specifically the trends of demand, supply, and emissions in Africa, and how these forecasts are being influenced by various factors that are ongoing on the continent. Next slide, please, Stefan. So looking at electricity demand in Africa, already in 2021, we saw that this had rebounded after this decline in 2020 due to the onset of the global pandemic. At the time of publication, this was estimated to be a growth of about 5.6% in electricity demand in 2021. And then forecasted to be a further 5% year-on-year growth in 2022. This is then forecasted to be followed by a slowdown in annual growth in demand across the continent for the period of 2023-2024 to the end of the forecast period, falling to around 3.5% on average. But of course, this varies from country to country, and the specific factors then which are influencing the changes or this growth in electricity demand will be explored in the next couple of slides, which dive a bit deeper into this. Next slide, please. So one of the drivers for demand growth for the forecast period, so 2021 to 2024, is driven by higher GDP growth following the shock to the economy by the COVID pandemic. And this recovery now is due in the GDP following from 2021 and then going onwards to towards 2024 is due to a combination of both improved global trade and increasing commodity prices. This growth, however, as per the IMF outlook, varies from country to country, and in some cases quite greatly. If we look, for example, at the GDP growth in countries like South Africa and Algeria, we see that this growth is relatively slow and is not expected, or is expected to have just recovered to pre-pandemic levels by the end of this year. However, if we look at other countries such as Morocco, Nigeria, and especially Egypt, these economies seem to be have been shielded from the impact of COVID-19 much better, and as such, the economies grow at a higher rate and continue to do so towards the end of the forecast period. Next slide, please. Now, along with GDP growth, we see the increase in electricity demand is also driven by two other factors. So one would be that new generation capacity is coming online over the next few years, which can alleviate power shortages in certain countries where this exists. Of the countries that we highlight in this report, the electricity market report that was released in January, Nigeria and South Africa are two which have capacity shortage or energy shortages, and so new capacity which comes online, obviously in those countries would be alleviating these power shortages and would lead to a reduction in the suppressed demand that you see in many countries. And this occurs not only in these countries but others which are maybe not highlighted specifically in the report. Another factor is, of course, increased electricity access. So if we look at electricity access in Africa, and especially sub-Saharan Africa, this is a major issue, with only around 48% of the population having access to electricity in 2019. And if we look at the share of electricity in total final energy consumption, this is sitting at 9.4% in 2019. And this is roughly half, or even less than half, of the global average, with a large share of energy consumption actually coming from the burning of traditional biomass. So an increase in electricity access, which would therefore lead to an increase in the share of electricity in the total final energy consumption, would also be then a driver for demand growth in the region. Next slide, please, Stefan. Now, if we then turn our attention to the supply side, we see that the majority of the demand growth in the forecast period is that we looked at on the previous slides is being met by either renewable or gas generation, as a host of renewable and gas projects have been or are being deployed across the continent going towards 2024. And so by 2024, this results in an additional 50 terawatt hours of electricity from renewables, taking it to a share of 26% of electricity generation, which brings it actually to parity with coal-fired generation, which sees its share slightly decline to about 26% or so by the end of 2024, according to our forecast. Now, this growth in renewables is being driven by very targeted policy. Now, some of this is playing out a bit more quickly than others and is reflected in our forecast, and some is yet to be necessarily reflected in the forecast yet, just to less concrete actions having taken place. But to just give some examples, Morocco has seen a major growth in renewables over the past decade. The share of renewables in the generation mix started at about 6% in 2008 and is in 2020 was at 20%. And Morocco has also stated its ambitions to expand its share of renewables beyond 52% by the end of 2030. And so this growth is expected to continue. And during the forecast period, we see that this will be thanks to new wind, solar PV, and pump storage hydro plants, which are then able to displace coal and then later gas from the generation mix. In other countries that we highlight in the report, Egypt has also set a target of 42% of its electricity to come from renewable sources by 2035 as part of its integrated sustainable energy strategy. And this has a more intermediate target of 20% by 2022. And this is as it aims to become a regional electricity hub and diversify its electricity mix. Now, while our forecast for Algeria is more bullish for the forecast period, its countries also has its energy transition strategy has also set a renewable objective, and this of 16 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2035, and then more or medium-term target of 4 gigawatts by the end of 2024. But this was at the end of last year. They had selected some sites for these for at least 1 gigawatt of solar capacity, but this is was not yet reflected in the forecasts. We were not as confident for it to be online within the forecast period, and so it's not necessarily reflected in our forecast. Now, if we turn our attention to South Africa, This, they also have policy which is looking towards growth in renewables, with their latest renewable auction having concluded concluded last year. Although the exact timing of the operation for this new renewable capacity to come online is not expected before 2024. However, it's hopeful that in later and in subsequent editions of this report, we'll see this accelerating and these targets actually having concrete capacity that we can reflect. Now, moving our attention away from renewables, of course, there's also a large amount of gas capacity that we see coming online, or gas generation, which is meeting this electricity demand. And this is within the forecast period, we see around 25 terawatt hours of additional gas generation to meet this electricity demand. And this actually makes it the largest source of electricity supply in Africa, where it will have a stable market share of around 38% between 2022 and 2024. Next slide, please, Stefan. Now, if we look at the emissions intensity of the power system in Africa, we see that due to a strong share of fossil fuels in the energy mix or the generation mix, including the large use of coal in South Africa, which is the largest power system in the continent, the carbon intensity in Africa as a region is much higher than the global average. If we see on the left in yellow, where it's sitting just below China. Now, however, as we see, renewables are set to supply the majority of this net demand growth, as we highlighted in the previous slide. We expect the carbon intensity of the electricity sector to decline, and this will decline by almost 2% on average during the period, according to the forecast. I think notably, if we look on the right, where we see the intensity by country, we can highlight Morocco in blue, which, thanks to new projects coming online as a result of their stated ambitions to expand the share of renewables, it sees the largest change in carbon intensity, dropping by 24% over the forecast period. And of course, this is something that we hope to see even more so in subsequent editions of the report, as we see even greater changes to this generation mix and more renewables deployed across the continent. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'll pass it over now to Jean-Baptiste, who will give a more in-depth look at global natural gas markets and specifically natural gas in Africa. So over to you, JB.
Thanks, Craig. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Jean-Baptiste Dubois. I'm in charge of short to medium term gas market analysis at the IEA. It's a pleasure, as my colleagues already said, it's a pleasure to be with you today to introduce you to some of the findings from our most recent research on gas markets and some focuses on the African gas markets. Move to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the gas markets, as Stefan and Craig emphasized for electricity, gas markets have also been hit last year by a decline in consumption. Last year, sorry, 2 years ago in 2020, owing to the COVID crisis and the lockdowns. As you can see on this slide on the left, growth has been quite steady over the past decade, and we've seen a less than 2% decline happening in 2020 as a result of the COVID situation and the lockdowns, which was more than compensated last year with an estimated 4.6 increase in global gas consumption, which was both the result of a strong economic recovery, both in mature markets across the Northern Hemisphere and also from fast-growing markets, and on the other hand, linked to a conjunction of weather-related factors, be it colder than average winter season in the Northern Hemisphere, and also drier summer, especially in Latin America, which has led to some disruption in hydro supply and backup core for gas-fired generation to support those electric systems. If we look now at the breakdown of growth on your right per region and per sector, you can see that it is a quite balanced contribution between the different regions, different users of gas. From the regional perspective, the main driver over the past years has remained fast-growing markets in Asia Pacific, the Middle East, and Africa, which altogether account for 2/3 of global gas consumption growth over the last decade. Asia has been the main driver, and China was the largest contributor as an individual country, followed by South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. The use of gas in those countries is mainly driven by non-power generation, especially by industry. As you can see on the right-hand side bar, the use per sector, industry has taken a strong share in that growth. And to a lesser extent, other users, the gray bar at the top, which is mainly driven by non-energy users, particularly for petrochemicals and fertilizers. Looking at the other sectors and regions' contributions in the Middle East, which accounts for roughly 20% of global gas consumption growth over the past decade, it's mainly driven by power generation, both in terms of additional electricity demand in those countries and also fuel switching away from oil and oil products, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Iran. In both cases, those countries have pursued a long-term strategy to maximize their oil export capacity to keep natural gas consumption for their domestic market. Now moving to more mature markets, you can see that over the past decade, North America has remained a strong component in global gas consumption, acting for a bit more than 25% up to 30% of global gas consumption increase over the past decade. This really owes to the specifics of the shale gas development in North America and particularly in the United States, which has had impact on all sectors, but mainly on the power generation side, where we saw a major shift away from coal generation with some limitation last year due to pricing issues, but a shrinking of the share of coal in the US power generation and a growing share of gas. Now moving to Africa, see on the top, Africa accounted for about 10% of global gas consumption increase over the past decade. This increase has been driven mainly by two factors: power generation on the one hand, and retail users. Industries also been a component, but less important than Asian markets. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So looking at the situation in Africa, this graph shows you the evolution of demand per major country over the past 20 years since the beginning of the century. You see that the overall consumption in Africa has almost tripled between 2000 and last year, according to our estimates. African gas consumption has not been that much impacted by the COVID crisis last year. You see it merely stagnated and has rebounded by over 5% last year as part of this rebound and more favorable market conditions. What is particularly striking, if you look at the composition of gas demand in Africa, is that it's overwhelmingly represented by two countries, Egypt and Algeria, so mainly by Northern African producing and exporting countries. The rationale for this is that these countries have been long-term producers of oil and gas. Algeria is a member of OPEC, has a very strong history, both gas consumption and gas exports to Europe and to the broader markets through liquefied natural gas. The story in Egypt is a bit more recent, doesn't date back to the 1970s, such as for Egypt. As you can see, the potential has been scaled up very strongly, especially over the past decade, with major discoveries in the Mediterranean, which has helped Egypt to increase substantially its consumption of gas and also its contribution to global gas trade. Apart from those two markets, which are now pretty mature in terms of gas coverage, the situation is quite different on the overall African market. Access to gas is fairly limited. And you can see in light purple that Nigeria, which is also a major oil and gas resource holder and the larger gas holder of reserves in Africa, is by comparison much less gasified than Egypt or Algeria. The access to gas as a domestic resource is difficult, and the policy framework and investment has been a building block in the development of access to gas in those countries. What we have seen over the past years is an acceleration of market conditions and policy conditions to ensure that gas markets are developing. On the one hand, to increase energy access in African countries, particularly in sub-Saharan African countries, and on the other hand, to ensure also the first step towards clean energy transition by phasing out the use of oil in power generation, which is both a costly and a polluting source of power generation, and also in retail uses to replace traditional biomass and LPG or kerosene for cooking purposes. Looking a bit more into the details, you see that at the top of the bars, you see that the consumption in what we have named Other Africa, which mainly comprises Western African countries outside of Nigeria, has been one of the drivers of growth over the past 5 years. This stems from initiatives from different countries in terms of both developing their domestic production, in the case of Senegal or Mauritania, for instance, or developing their access to resources through pipeline exchanges with Nigeria, in the case of Ivory Coast or Benin or Togo, or developing their access to LNG markets, such as in the case of Ghana, which has opened last year its first LNG importing terminal. But one of the components is building a toolkit of policies that helps to increase this access to natural gas in African countries, in terms of pricing, in terms of regulation, also in terms of access to investment in infrastructure. Moving to the next slide, please. Thanks. So one of the key points in market opening is access to competition and how pricing is devised on those markets. Market reforms, so as an introduction from a global perspective, market reforms is a process that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, even in mature markets. If we look back at the example of North America, Europe, or mature countries in Asia, such as Korea or Japan, opening gas and electricity markets is a process that takes decades. And there's no reason why it would be faster in other markets. So it's a long-term perspective that needs strong commitment and buy-in from the different stakeholders. In the case of Africa, we have seen moves over the past years that go into the direction to more opening, more competition, also more transition towards gas-to-gas pricing systems. As you can see on this slide, there's still the bulk of gas pricing in Africa is still regulated. That's what we call below cost regulations. That's basically subsidized pricing for different reasons, whether it be for social purposes or to facilitate the growth of the market in its early stages. It's interesting to see that the evolution is not directly correlated with the maturity of the markets. For instance, one of the most mature markets in Africa, Algeria, is fully regulated below cost, whereas we're seeing some opening, especially for wholesale customers in Nigeria and some other West African countries, and Egypt is in between. The Egyptian policy is to move towards deregulated electricity prices. Electricity is a major component of gas consumption, so therefore the gas prices for wholesale customers, whether it be power generation or large consuming industries, is progressively moving from a subsidized to a cost plus regulation, and ultimately towards a more competitive onset. So as you can see on the right-hand side, the situation has evolved quite significantly since 2005, according to the collection of information which is provided by the International Gas Union on gas prices globally. Now, subsidized pricing as of 2020 accounted for about 60% of global pricing in Africa, bearing in mind that in between 2005 and 2020, African gas consumption more than doubled at the same time. So this is moving ahead. We've seen some interesting and very important steps being taken recently, in spite of the difficult situation and all the COVID-related hardships. One, just to name a few, I was mentioning the market reforms in Egypt. Craig mentioned the ambitious plans set by the Algerian government to develop additional renewable capacity for its power mix, which will help to improve the footprint of power generation in Algeria, but also alleviate some of the pressure, very strong pressure, that is currently on the supply of the domestic Algerian market. Just to mention also, outside of North Africa, a couple of initiatives, like in Senegal in 2019, the development of a gas law, gas code that embeds the ruling of the domestic market, which is due to further develop this year and next year with the commissioning of first phase of Senegal and Mauritania's offshore gas production with the Grand Tortue complex. And last year in 2021 was a big milestone for Nigeria oil and gas with the new Petroleum Industry Act, which was signed by the Nigerian president at the end of summer, which is a complete review of the Nigerian oil and gas industry, sets a lot of new targets in terms of regulation, in terms of market opening, and paves the way for further development of a more open and competitive gas markets in Nigeria. One last point I wanted to cover in this presentation, in the next slide please, is that of course those important developments in Africa cannot be completely disconnected from the situation we're seeing on other markets, on other more mature markets, especially what's happening today in terms of prices. My colleagues already alluded to the large uncertainty that results from the current situation in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. What we have seen in terms of gas prices is extreme volatility and very high level of prices. As you can see on this chart, we come from a situation in the middle of 2020 where gas was almost free into a situation today as we speak, as gas prices have reached all-time records, but we can say the same for most commodities in the current situation. Of course, there's great uncertainty on price volatility and price levels is creating a lot of unrest on the markets. It is also likely to create some potential issues for the path of market opening in price-sensitive markets, particularly in Africa, if we're looking at gas importing markets. Thank you very much for your attention. I think that this concludes our presentation. Thanks to everyone, and back to you, Zakia.
Thanks a lot, Jean-Baptiste, Craig, and Stefan, for this very interesting presentation. And for the participants, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send it to us in the Q&A box. Or if you want to take the floor and say live your questions, please don't raise your hand and let us know. I'll give you the permission to speak. In the meantime, we already have two questions in the Q&A box, both, I think, on the natural gas section. So the first one is, what is the end-use demand for natural gas in the last consumer countries such as Algeria and Egypt? Jean-Baptiste, would you like to reply to this one?
Yeah, thanks, Zakia. So for both countries, in Egypt, there is a growing use for non-energy purposes, particularly in the chemicals industry and also fertilizers. Egypt is one of the biggest agricultural powers in the region, but also for base materials, whether it be for glass, paper, non-ferrous minerals, and so on. So in Algeria, this is more or less the same situation, but with a very strong dominance of petrochemicals, which is part of the oil and gas compound that was developed by Algeria state-owned companies in the 1970s and 80s.
Thank you. And we have Michael, who would like some more explanation on the oil indexation. I think it was slide 16 where you presented this.
Yeah, thanks. Well, actually, I forgot to mention about it. This remains quite limited in the case of Africa. So in most gas importing countries, gas is usually paid at an oil index price to the seller in the absence of domestic or recognized gas-to-gas competition reference price. So in most markets, particularly in the markets where there's no liquid domestic gas price reference, oil is used as the reference. And this is the case in most Asian and Latin American and African countries when they import natural gas.
Thank you. So we have a few more minutes left before the end of this session. So if you have any more questions for my colleagues, don't hesitate. There's a new question. Why is Africa's carbon intensity higher than that of the US? What metrics are you using, and how would we improve Africa's intensity based on the same metrics manipulation? Was there a slide? Maybe Stefan, we can put again the slide where we show carbon intensity.
I don't know. Well, Stefan, maybe you could expand on it a little bit. But what I will say to this is that the carbon intensity in Africa is obviously heavily weighted by the coal generation in South Africa, which is by far the largest power system in Africa. And of course, apart from that, you also have large amounts of gas generation, which we touched upon. And so I think in South Africa, it's close to 90% of power generation coming from coal, which of course makes it a very heavily emitting generation source, or a heavily emitting system. So I think this is one of the reasons why we see such a high carbon intensity for the power sector. But in terms of how it was actually calculated, I would leave that to Stefan, who obviously led this work and would be more familiar with the calculation of it.
Yeah, so this is the case. It's a higher share of coal in the generation mix. In the US, we have a lot of gas in the mix. Even if you see here in 2021, we have a slight increase in the emissions intensity in the US. This was due to the high gas prices, and then we had a bit of fuel switching, that gas declined a bit and coal increased again. But in general, we have a high share of gas, and gas is about, I think, half as carbon intensive as coal. So this makes a big difference. How this is calculated, so we have different types of fuels. You have a carbon content in each fuel. So primarily it's gas and coal that's driving the emissions. You have some oil, but that's usually not a big thing in most markets. And then you have the higher carbon content, so higher associated emissions with burning coal instead of gas. And then that's driving the intensity. So we are just calculating the total emissions based on the fuel consumption, and then dividing by the total electricity what was produced.
Yes. And also given that in electricity generation, for example, in the US, we have more renewables as well. So that makes the intensity much lower. We have another participant who raised his hand. So Shiza Kula, would you like to say something?
Hi, Zaki. I asked a question. Thanks for the presentation, by the way, by the two presenters. I'm the one that asked the question on the carbon intensity. I'm sorry to just belabor the point, but I don't seem to have understood clearly the metrics that they used. I did ask that they compare the carbon intensity of Africa to that of the US, and why Africa's is higher. I do understand the carbon content aspects, vis-a-vis gas or coal, but I thought that maybe what was used was a metric such as maybe gigawatt hours per GDP. Such would be what I thought would relate to intensity measure. So I don't know, maybe they could elaborate further on that. I still don't understand why Africa should be higher than the US. And also, I did ask how then would we improve it based on the same metrics that they used. Thank you.
So I think the improvement would be changing in the mix. So it's the same as the reason when we have a higher share of coal in the generation mix, we have less renewables. So that kind of could be then changed by integrating more renewables into the mix, changing away a bit from coal to gas. So that would lower the emission intensity. Yeah, so this is the kind of a measure we are using, the intensity per generated kilowatt hour of electricity. You could also think about other measures. So what's the intensity related to the GDP, but then you would probably rather use the overall energy consumption, the overall emissions, because you have in each country, you have a different mix of what energies you use in the industry. If you use electricity, if you use directly gas or coal. So if you would only calculate then the electricity emissions and then related to the GDP, there would be a distortion of the result because the share of electricity in the overall mix of what the industry is using is very different. So that is something definitely the intensity of, let's say, the whole society of the GDP for all energy sources, but just for electricity, I think it makes more sense to relate the output of electricity to the total emissions.
Was that explanation clear enough for you, Shisa Kula? Thanks. I think we have one more question. In one of the presentations, it was stated that good policies have fostered the growth of renewables in Morocco. What particular policies make Morocco stand out or attractive?
Yeah, so I mean, what I was saying, so in our forecast, we see that there's a good growth of renewables in Morocco. And one of the things that why I highlighted it was if you can actually see this reflected in the carbon intensity of their power sector. So they've obviously had from very government stated policies or objectives that have set out renewable targets for renewables. So in this case, this has been happening for the last decade, even where their their share of renewables has increased from I think it was 6% in 2008 to 20% in 2020, and they've now and they still have now targets which they've redefined their ambitions, or they extended their ambitions to have 52% by 2035, I believe. Let me just double check this. Or by 2030, 52% by 2030. And obviously, so setting these ambitions and objectives provides clear signals to developers and that there's in order to deploy these projects. So it's something that can help for financing. It's something that can help for ensuring that all the procedures that help for the deployment of renewables, be it changes in the way that electricity markets function, changes in grid codes, changes in all the sort of technical changes that are needed to deploy higher shares of renewables, those are all in place. One of the things that Morocco are doing, for example, is the deployment of, they are deploying also pump storage hydro. So, which obviously is another flexibility option, which helps with for the integration of renewables. And so, I mean, apart from Morocco, you also see Algeria have strong renewable policies now stated, which are maybe they're less developed as Morocco, because Morocco has been doing this for or has objectives which stretch far greater in time. But Algeria are doing it, and so are Egypt in diversifying their energy mix. And so more the point to highlight Morocco is that you can see this actually playing out and seeing how this is progressing for their system. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight it. Obviously, strong policy is one of the things that helps for the deployment of renewables for so many aspects, be it these changes needed for on a technical level or a regulatory level or at a market level, but also for financing projects, especially when private developers are involved. Oh, sorry, Zakia, you're on mute.
So, yeah, I was saying thanks a lot for the explanation. There's no more new questions, and we have reached also the end of our session. I would like to thank you, Stefan, Craig, and Jean-Baptiste for the presentation, and also to all the participants for all the questions. So this session has been recorded, and we will be putting it on YouTube later today. So you can also have access to it and share with other people if needed. And thank you very much. And see you next month for the next IEA Africa University series. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.